Yes, yes, yes. 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 Yes. That is how the renowned preacher Dr. James Forbes began when he got in the pulpit. It went on for some time. I mean, a long time. Everyone singing, yes, yes, yes. I have to admit that as the pastor of the church who invited him to preach, after a while I began to wonder, is this why we brought Dr. Forbes up from Riverside Church in New York City all the way up to Wellesley, Massachusetts, so that he can lead us in a one-word chant? Eventually he got around to preaching. He released that word yes into the air and stirred it, let it move through the congregation, and then he preached his sermon into it. His sermon was wonderful, of course, but I don't remember much of anything he said. What I do remember is him singing, yes, yes, yes. And I remember what it was like for all of us to join our voices with his singing, yes, 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 just one word. But what a word. A noted professor of philosophy, as he neared retirement, told his students that in his final class of his final semester, he would attempt to summarize his entire philosophy in a single lecture. The professor was an erudite and learned man who could speak at length on virtually any subject. But to summarize one's entire life's work in a single lecture is a considerable challenge. Word about his upcoming lecture spread beyond the philosophy department, spilled over to the rest of the campus. At the appointed hour, the lecture hall was packed. Student and professors alike, many leaning over open notebooks, all eager for the philosopher's final lecture and the summary of his philosophy. The professor ascended to the lectern, and after thanking them all for coming, he said, "Perhaps." And with that, he left the room. Perhaps. Perhaps is such a different word from yes. Which is the more profound word? And is one more difficult to say than the other? Now, before we go further, we need to remind ourselves that yes is not the right word in every circumstance. In instances of oppression or abuse, a firm no is the appropriate response. In the face of injustice, often the word no is called for. And it can take courage to say no, no more, no longer. But in other kinds of circumstances, it can take a particular courage to say yes, to affirm something. In many settings, it's easier to say perhaps or to say no than it is to affirm something. If we affirm something, we may be asked to defend ourselves. That's much more likely if we're saying yes than if we're saying perhaps. Who has to defend perhaps? I think it can be hard to be caught affirming something, particularly these days. What with all the corrosive negativity and entrenched cynicism that is evident in our time. In fact, it seems to me that even going to church is more difficult these days because even in the simple act of going to worship, you are affirming something. You are affirming something in the midst of a skeptical culture. You are saying yes in a culture of no. I'm old enough to remember a time when people who decided not to go to worship on Sunday morning might feel as if they had to explain themselves. No longer. Now it's the people who go to worship who are more likely to feel as if they have to explain themselves. Why is that? Because by going to worship, we are affirming something. We may have our doubts. Who doesn't? But by the simple act of worship, we are affirming something. Going to worship, listening to good news, in some way receiving the good news is a way of saying yes in a culture that leans toward no. No to our neighbors or those who seek to be our neighbors. No to enlarging our capacity for compassion. No to the poor, the sick, the prisoner, the disenfranchised. No to the one who doesn't look like us or dress like us or talk like us or pray like us. Injustice is no justice. True justice is yes justice. And sometimes it takes courage to say yes. I want to speak personally here. I knew right away that this congregation has a tremendous ability to say yes. I knew it right away because you called me as your senior minister when I was 27 years old. 27 years old. Less than 2 years out of seminary. What a crazy thing for a congregation to do. In Vermont, no less. In old, resistant to change Vermont, you call a 27-year-old minister. By so doing, in essence, you affirm that God can do a surprising thing. God can say yes to something that seems, well, kind of crazy. After my candidating sermon, I heard that Ruth LeGros, long-standing First Church member and office manager, said about meeting me for the first time, I wasn't sure if I should shake his hand or put him over my shoulder and burp him. True story. All my stories are true. One other memory from that day. After I preached and the worship was over, my wife Karen and I were ushered into the chapel where we'll gather later. As the congregation deliberated on whether to call me as their minister, Betty Moser, wife of Don, who was chair of the search committee, waited with us. Just the three of us. While the congregation met, we waited, and we waited, and we waited, and minutes seemingly stretching to eternity. Then, finally, we heard the footsteps of someone running down the hall to the chapel. Bursting through the door of the chapel like a cork popping from a bottle of champagne came a young boy who exclaimed, "You only got 2 no's!" True story. 2 no's for this crazy idea. 2 no's in a congregation of yes. Make no mistake, First Church, you are a congregation of yes, of possibility, of meeting challenge, of courage, of occasional craziness. As I say, I learned that from the start. One example comes to mind from my own installation here as senior minister. It was at the reception after the service that Bill Hollister, then minister of Christ Church Presbyterian here in Burlington, asked me about the congregation's plans for the former parsonage on the church grounds, since my family would not be living there. I told him that it was being studied. And he replied simply, "We need to talk." And we did talk the very next week. He told me about the plans to start a Ronald McDonald House. but they had not found a suitable location. Fast forward a few months, and First Church was signing a lease to the Ronald McDonald House for $1 a year, year after year, $1 a year. How crazy is that? And how wonderful is that? First Church, you became aware of a need, were presented with a way to meet that need, and you said yes. That's the kind of church you are. Who knows what might come out of this installation? You never know. But this I do know. First Church has always been, continued to be, a congregation of yes. When Reverend Bob Lee sends the call to serve with partners at James Hospital in Colachal, India, this congregation, not just those who chose to travel with him, but the entire congregation said yes. When New Alpha Missionary Baptist Church was looking for a place to worship and for a congregation with whom to partner around a common vision, you, First Church, said yes. And have continued to do so for decades now. Yes, yes, yes. Those are just a couple of examples. I could add others. You could add many more that all point to the same reality. First Church, you are a congregation of yes. And your new pastor, you've called a yes woman. Well, that's probably not the way to put it, is it? Not a yes woman, as in someone who does not know her own mind or blindly follows along. Decidedly not. So how about this? You have called a pastor of yes. She has a gift for yes. She embodies a joyous yes to the gospel. She offers an affirming yes to others. She does not shrink from responding yes to possibility. She has the courage to say yes when others shrink behind an easy no. Perhaps you know that for 2 years, Elissa and I were pastoral colleagues at Wellesley Village Church in Wellesley, Massachusetts. So I know of whom I speak. Elissa is a living, breathing, walking, talking, listening, serving, preaching, praying, singing embodiment of yes. A yes congregation with a yes pastor, the Holy Spirit can really do something with a covenant partnership like that. The Apostle Paul reminds us that our own yes is made possible and is grounded in Jesus, who is God's yes to us. In Jesus, God seeks to enfold us in God's own affirmation. Yes, yes, yes. Paul was chastised by the church in Corinth because he changed his plans about coming to visit them. Their feelings were hurt, and so they started to complain. Sounds like church, doesn't it? They accused him of being inconsistent, a flip-flopper. First he says yes, and then he says no. When Paul writes back, he says in effect, I changed my plans. It does not mean I am inconsistent. I don't say yes and no to you at the same time, any more than Jesus does. In Jesus, it is always yes, he says. And then he goes on to offer this affirmation. All the promises of God find their yes in him. With Jesus, it is always yes. All the promises of God find their yes in him. There it is. The entire gospel summarized in a single word, the word yes. When Paul says that in Jesus it is always yes, he does not mean that Jesus affirms everything that happens in the world. There are people who seem to have an unfailingly cheery assessment of the world, concluding that people are essentially good, everyone means well, things always turn out for the best. I have a friend who's one of those cheery folks. She collects what she calls life-affirming songs, plays them over and over again. The sentiments of those songs all seem to be variations on that old song, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, and don't mess with Mr. In-Between. But you know, I can't get over the impression that all the cheeriness is actually whistling past the graveyard. After all, if life really were always that cheery, always that positive, would you need so many songs to remind you? When Paul says that in Jesus it is always yes, he is not whistling past the graveyard, because the story of Jesus is not over until he spent some time in the graveyard. It's about life as it really is. It encompasses all of life, the shadows as well as the light, both the sin and the redemption, both death and resurrection. So before the yes, there is a no. The human family used every way we knew to say no to Jesus. We betrayed him, we mocked him, we denied him, and then we killed him. We said no in every way we knew how. And in response to that no, in Jesus, it is always yes. The resurrection is God's yes to the world. God wouldn't take our no for an answer. Before and after and under and above, our definite no is God's triumphant yes. There's a famous book on negotiation called Getting to Yes. Well, that could be a title for the gospel story. Because in Jesus, God always gets to yes. Or as poet Wallace Stevens wrote, after the final no, there comes a yes. And on that yes, the future world depends. I was once among a group of authors asked to summarize the gospel in 7 words. It's quite a challenge. 7 words. Here's what I came up with. God gets the last word. I know, that's only 5 words. So I'm going to save the other 2 for another time. If I'd been allowed to expand a bit, I would have said this. Our God is the kind of God who insists on having the last word. Now, the second to last word, which can be very powerful, can be given over to something else. Evil, disease, oppression, hopelessness, even death itself. But our God is the kind of God who insists on having the very last word. And that's always a word of goodness, a word of healing, a word of liberation, a word of hope, a word of life. God gets the last word. And that word is yes. If I were asked to summarize the Christian gospel in 1 word, not 7 words or 5 words, but 1 word, it would be the word yes. Not perhaps. Yes. So I love what the poet E.E. Cummings wrote. I imagine that yes is the only living thing. Cummings also wrote, I thank you, God, for most this amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees, and a blue true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. Yes, yes, 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 yes. Yes, yes.